There's something hiding in the woods, and it's not a person, and it might just well be your nightmare. Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to be compiling a bunch of my favorite and your favorite stories from the past few months on the topics of deep woods, park rangers, the Great Lakes, rivers, and pretty much anything outdoors. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, please be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you're new to the swamp, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications as I upload videos nearly every single day. Don't forget to drop a like on this video. And get ready for some creepy and allegedly true in the woods horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. I'm not incredibly good at writing, so I apologize if this is not as good as the other stories you've read. However, I would love it if you would read this on the show, as it is probably a surreal experience hearing my story. Anyways, I do have an account to share, so I like going on hikes with my friends in the summer to a creek behind our house. On the way to the creek, there was always a cement building. It is not exactly a building, more like a big cement box. There is no doorway, but it is decently sized. Maybe the size of an RV or taller. We have never thought much of it. You find all sorts of odd things in the woods. One time, in the early summer, like June, my friend decided to do a more in-depth look around. We just finished watching an episode of Stranger Things, which at the time we thought was super scary, so we were in the mood to find something spooky. First, we checked around the cement rectangle and found a small slit at the bottom in the back. It looked like one of those small narrow windows that you would find in basements. We dug in the dirt until we had a big enough opening to squeeze through. When we got in, we started realizing our situation. We were in a concrete box with a tiny rectangle hole that took us 15 minutes to get through. My friend even started hyperventilating, so we decided to call one of our friends just to lighten the mood. So we called and showed him the box, and after about 5 minutes of talking to him, he suddenly said, "Get out of there now." My stomach dropped, and I could feel myself getting pale. We hurriedly made our way out. I say impatiently, but it was probably 5 to 10 minutes. When we made it out, we asked our friend what he saw. We thought he was pranking us, but he's not that type. He is the kind of friend that laughs at every one of your jokes. He said he saw a dark figure hunched over in the corner. We told him it was impossible. We looked around the whole room and didn't see anything. He described it as just a pitch-black figure hunched over in the corner, like how you think that SCP-096 monster would look. I do not know if this was a practical joke, which you probably think it is, but I know our friend better. He said he didn't even see a passing glimpse. He just saw it or him. There was nothing in the box, nothing to mistake as a person. We have never visited that box again and never plan to. Unfortunately, I have no contact with either of them because that was a year ago, and I have moved. Thank you for reading my story if you choose to. Hello, Swamp Dweller. It's Vince again. I hadn't planned to write you again, but after the positive reviews and my friends continuing to encourage me, I decided to write you again. I'm going to share with you and your viewers of one of the most bizarre experiences I've had while hunting these creatures. I know my stories are a bit different than the usual stories you receive, but I hope you still enjoy it. So this takes place a few years after the previous story I sent in. I had been on a few successful hunts and had learned a decent amount about these things. I'd see a comment that called them gugwe, so I will use that term from here on out. It's nice to have a name to these things regardless if it's right or not. So I had killed a few of these gugwe, but hadn't seen any in a few months. I believed I had run them out of the area and didn't really know how to find them again. I had the idea to use the BFRO website to look up sightings that may match the behavior of the gugwe versus a regular Bigfoot. After searching for I don't even remember how long, I finally found a sighting from around Connor, Montana, about a shorter Bigfoot climbing into a tree. Finally, I thought. It made sense to me that the gugwe would travel further north away from the area that I was in. I called my boss saying I was sick and I needed a few days off, packed my gear, and took off for Montana. It wasn't an overly long drive, and I was in Connor by the end of the day. I knew by then that they moved primarily at night and did not want to be making my way into the mountains in the dark where they had the advantage. So I stayed in my car that night and set off in the morning to the area of the sighting. It was around mid-May, so the weather was fairly nice, and I enjoyed the hike into the backcountry. I made it to the area by noon and had begun scouting for any signs. I learned to look for subtle things like branches broken too high up to be from an elk or a moose, or scratches in the bark too high up to be a bear. I wasn't having any luck finding anything and spent the next few days roaming the valleys looking for anything and spending the nights up on the ridges out of the trees. Being May, I didn't need to build a fire, so I would sit up at night looking down into the valley with my thermal scope, while wrapped in an insulated blanket to hide my shape. One night I saw a sow grizzly with 2 of her cubs below me into the valley. I remember thinking to myself that the odds of the gugway, who I believed to be an apex predator, and a grizzly, who I knew was an apex predator, being in the same area was extremely slim, and decided to move the next valley over the following day. As they disappeared into the trees and out of view, I scanned back to my left and saw a flash of orange in the trees about 300 yards below me. I focused on the area but couldn't find what it was again. I scanned right back in the direction of the grizzly and could see the mother had come back where I could see her, and she was standing up, sniffing the air, staring in the direction where I had seen the flash. The mother bear had to be close to 7 feet herself, and was at least 600 to 700 pounds easily. I thought to myself that there is absolutely no way that a gugway was going to try this bear. As I had that thought, I scanned back to the left and could see between the swaying of the trees and their cool blue branches that a fire-red heat signature was showing through. It was roughly 20 feet up the tree and 50 yards from the mother bear. Was I about to see this? I remember thinking. I scanned back to the bear, and she was now facing the opposite direction. I looked that way again. I saw red showing from between branches in that direction as well. There were 2 gugway on either side of the bear. They were hunting her or her cubs. Back to the bear, I could see she was still standing, but both cubs were now at her side, and she was looking back and forth. I was in shock at this point. I had my suspicions about how they hunted, but this was showing an unnerving level of confidence and intelligence. The gugway, to the bear's right, began screaming in a blood-curdling way that made me want to drop my rifle and cover my ears. But I stayed on the scope. The bear reacted exactly how you would think and turned to its right, dropped to all fours, and positioned itself between the gugway and its cubs. Something told me to scan left, and I could see the gugway in that direction moving from tree to tree closer to the bear and its cubs until it was only a few trees away. It was still 15 feet up the tree, and gugway on the right was shaking the tree it was in to distract the mother bear. The closer gugway dropped out of the tree onto the ground and tried to grab one of the cubs, but the sow was too fast. It reacted before the gugway could react. The bear and the gugway were fighting when the second gugway dropped from the tree and charged over, hitting the bear from behind. She turned to it and was about to stand when the first gugway jumped back onto it. It was a 2-on-1 fight, and the bear couldn't focus on one without the other attacking it. I was frozen in place watching the mother bear try to fight off the 2 gugway and protect her cubs. She was trying her best but couldn't seem to stay on one long enough before the other made an attack on her and tried for her cubs. It was heartbreaking to watch. Finally, something in me snapped awake, and I realized that this bear wasn't all that different from me. If I had gotten to my daughter that day, I would have fought just as hard as she is now. In a weird way, I was watching what would happen to this bear. This filled me with an intense sadness, and that was almost immediately replaced with rage. I wouldn't sit by and watch what happened to me happen to this bear. Some people would argue that what I was watching was just nature, but these gugway are not part of the natural order. I don't know exactly what they are or what part they play, but I do know it's not natural. I put my crosshairs on the gugway, calculated it was about 325 yards, and sent a round into its center mass. The loud shot echoed over the valley, and I could see it lurch back from the hit. I pulled the trigger again and sent another round into its chest, 2 for 2. The other gugway must have noticed its partner was hurt and made the fatal mistake of taking its eye off the bear. Now it was 1-on-1, and the mother bear was going to make this gugway pay for attacking its cubs. The enraged mother never lost focus or even reacted to my shots, and as the gugway shifted its focus to its partner, the bear was on it. She had it on the ground and was thrashing it back and forth before it pushed itself away and managed to get back onto its feet. It looked to be the same height as the bear, and I could tell the bear had done some damage by its stance. The mother bear charged it again and the Gugwe tried to run to a tree, but the bear was too fast. I watched as the bear hit it from behind, and as soon as the Gugwe was on the ground, the bear had attacked the back of its neck in her mouth and had began to shake it with more violence than I had believed was even possible. It became clear to me that when one-on-one with a grizzly, it could get the best of these things easily, which made sense why they stayed further south away from the grizzly's range. I watched the grizzly finish off the Gugwe and then go investigate the one I had shot. I could tell it was still alive, and obviously, so could the bear. The Gugwe didn't stay alive much longer. Once the mother bear was satisfied that the two Gugwe were no longer a threat, she retreated into the dense forest with her two cubs. My adrenaline was coming down at that point and I was becoming incredibly tired. I wanted desperately to look closer at the Gugwe, but had no idea where the bear had gone and had no intention of becoming the next target of her protective instincts. I decided I would crawl into my tent and investigate in the morning. I awoke not long after daybreak and looked where the Gugwe should have been, but they were gone. I don't think the bear came back and dragged them off, and I know they were dead, so there must have been another one that took them away, just like the others I had killed. From my experience, once one was killed, the others in the area would leave, and with two being killed in one night, I was sure if there were others, they were long gone, so I decided to call it quits in that area. I was out of that area and back home by the next day, and I'll never forget that night. Watching the mother grizzly fight made me realize that the natural world had already been fighting back against these things long before I arrived, and it would be fighting long after I have stopped, and I believe that the natural world would win. I just hope I'm still here to watch the last Gugwe die. Whether it's by my rifle or by a grizzly's bite, both are fine by me. Hi Swamp Dweller, I just want to let you know that this podcast rocks and I hope it stays up for years to come. While listening to one of your latest episodes concerning crime, memories popped up in my head about the times me and my brother would hike together. For context, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and try to escape the city life on the weekends by hiking in the mountains, exploring old sewage systems, and, my favorite, taking trips down into the Rio Salado to explore the swampy desert habitat and see what has changed. Things have changed since I last went, and now I don't really want to go back at all. It was a moderately warm Sunday when we set out to hike down the rocky trails. I had just gotten my driver's license and was excited to go driving off places by myself. Luckily, I wasn't alone this time though. As I have said, my two brothers were with me, and I was grateful for it because things had changed. As we continued down the trails, I realized that the amount of trash had doubled. Plastic bottles, Safeway bags, and every possible litter imaginable was strewn about and dried in the riverbed. In the past, we had tried to clean some of it up, but now it would be pointless unless we had an entire team on the job. Further down the trail, a ranger came walking up. She turned into our trail and then walked across it into another, heading towards a homeless man that was... I don't know what he was doing. A tent was set up and he was kicking around some trash. She talked to him for a little while before departing. She headed back up the trail, going right past us, while the homeless man disappeared over a giant mound of dirt. Another homeless man had set up his tent nearby and he was eyeing us. He vanished into his tent, and we decided that it was best to leave this area. We hiked back the way we had came and left the trail farther back, which led us to the riverside. There we found an aluminum can with a lizard trapped inside of it, portraying how this pollution was affecting the environment. I've come across several of these situations down here. Once, it was the same can design and same lizard species. Weird. But we ended up slicing open the can to release him, because the opening was too small for them to squeeze back through. But as we sauntered down the riverside, we came across another tent and a mound of toilet paper and human feces. We turned back and decided to head back down the river again, but we ended up running into another homeless guy on the other side of the river, washing himself and drinking. We soon left and went back up to the main trail. Hiking past the mound of dirt, the first homeless guy had walked all the way around it and ended up making his way back up the main trail. My teenage brothers are usually careful and don't mess around, but this time the youngest one climbed up to the top of the dirt mound and looked down. "Hey, there's a tent down here," he said. "Get down," said my other brother, but he didn't. Instead, he continued down towards it, not even sure if someone was in there. "Get your ass down here," I whispered fiercely. Since we were underneath a giant bridge, my voice echoed. My brother took no head. Instead, he picked up a rock and tossed it toward the tent. That was it. I marched up the mound and yanked my brother down, pushing him aside. He got really pissed at me though. But he was being an idiot. Tampering around with homeless people's tents? Time to get to higher ground, I thought. Then maybe home, especially after that had happened. We continued upwards and found many more tents and piles of pornographic magazines and rusty needles. I hoped that if we got into a confrontation with one of these homeless people, he would let us pass. But many years had passed since I had explored this part, so things were much different now compared to the last. As we reached a cluster of mesquite trees, we saw another homeless man, except it wasn't some short guy in a tent. This guy must have been 6'4", and he was no stork. He was well-built and muscular. He glanced toward us, then disappeared, but I had my head turned and didn't see which direction he went. But I knew it was time to go, especially with another homeless man slowly gaining on us. We fled into the brush, which had many tent-like structures slung over branches, but surprisingly there wasn't really anybody there. This labyrinth of polluted brush with a thorny canopy overhead went on for quite some distance, but that's when we heard something following us. I turned to my brothers. "Did you hear that?" They both nodded, probably just thinking it was a rabbit or something to rationalize things in our brain so we didn't freak out further. We continued to crawl through the thorn bushes, but whatever was making those noises was getting closer and louder. I was pretty sure that it wasn't a rabbit at this point. It was big, much bigger than a coyote. It sounded like a human being, and it was crashing through the brush, getting faster and more intense. We could hear the footsteps in the dry leaves behind us. "Run!" I whispered, and we crawled, ran, squeezed, and scratched ourselves as we retreated blindly into the briars and bushes. Whatever it was had gotten even closer and louder. At this point, we had our knives pulled and were getting tired. If this person caught up, it would be our last resort, and we were ready. "There!" One of my brothers pointed. The bushes began to clear, and there appeared to be a way out of this dangerous maze. We literally threw ourselves out and scrambled up the side of a slanted boulder wall to escape the stalker. As soon as we made it out into the clearing, the guy had stopped his pursuit and crashed back through the brush. When we saw the park ranger's truck parked further down the trail over the wall, we knew we were safe again. But we didn't report anything to her. I mean, who would believe us? Instead, we trekked all the way back up and ran across the parking lot, piling into our Ford Focus. I haven't made any recent trips there to go hiking, and I don't plan on hiking there anytime soon. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this one. I'm in college, and me and some friends, 7 people to be exact, from my school went on a hiking trip. We had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Park, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple of other groups of people there as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-age girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I have always been able to sense energies of places, and the energy in this area was not good. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed kind of a cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back, so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared-off square in the middle of trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent, and they sort of have a heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog, and it also sounded like it was just 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature or person was circling my tent for very long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping. It would sound like they were there just breathing outside of my tent before it would pick up and start walking again. I could very clearly hear a human being breathing from the mouth, or something that was very similar to a human being breathing from the mouth, like a light sort of heaving almost. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, This occurred for hours on end, and it seemed like I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent because it was all zipped up. It was like a warm glow and it didn't move, like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point, I fall asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers and hikers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre, and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said they also noticed the light that came on, but thought it was someone else in the group. Not a single person in the group went up to go to the bathroom or turned on a light that night. I've heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I 100% believe it. I've leaned towards Bigfoot because apparently he is associated with light orbs, but I've never been a Bigfoot believer. But I'm telling you, this didn't feel like just any other bear. I was hunting for black bear one day, back in the early 2000s. The area I was hunting in was northern Clinton County. It's quite a hike to get to where I need to be. My ex-brother-in-law and I enjoyed the area and spent many a season scouting and hiking these lands before it was time to hunt. This part of the county is filled with long hollows, steep inclines, and hard-to-access trails. We both like to do our own thing and hunt on separate terrains. I would often dive down into the hollows while he scoured the ridgelines, hoping to get a shot at whatever I pushed over the tops. We both carried pretty bumped up two-way radios to keep up general idea of where we both were, although often the terrain made it too difficult for good reception. This day was a typical Pennsylvania bear season day. It was on the Wednesday of the season, third to last day of the brief season it was back then. The woods were quiet, with no distant whooping or yodeling of various opening day camps pushing drives through the woods. The weather was cold, gray, and windy when we separated to begin our hunt and continued throughout the day. I spent the day still hunting down this long hollow south of a little town in north-central Clinton County with the idea of meeting my brother-in-law at the top of a ridge that we agreed on, sometime around 4 p.m., giving us plenty of time to hike together the next few miles back to his truck. After hunting all day, I found an old game trail that appeared to meander its way back to the ridge line towards where I knew he would be waiting for me. After close to an hour, maybe around 3:30 or so, I made my way 2/3 of the way to the top, stopping often, scouring the slope for that jet black fur of a roaming bear. Along the trail, I came upon a long ago used fire ring. It was very rudimentary in its build and appeared to be used maybe one time. The ring's rocks were covered in lichen, and only about the faintest of traces of black from a long ago fire. I found it odd that a fire ring would be here, considering the steepness of the slope, but it was very small and somewhat of a level edge. There, I figured I would sit and eat the rest of my packed food and sit still, hoping to catch a final chance to see a bear. All the while it felt odd, somewhat unwelcoming, like I shouldn't be there or something. I almost felt like I was a forbidden interloper on someone's valued quote-unquote spot. I sat for maybe 20 minutes and thought that it was time to continue my trek upward towards my friend. As I stood up, I slung my backpack on and reached down to sling my rifle over my left shoulder. As I stood up, I heard my name called loudly. It didn't really sound like it was behind me, rather all around in my head. Just as I was going to turn around, my rifle was slapped off my shoulder. I felt the force, heard something slap against the wood of the stock, and crouched quickly to save my gun from dashing to the rocks. I grabbed it in the nick of time and quickly turned around with a mouthful of profanities, for whom I thought was going to be my brother-in-law jacking with me. There was nobody there at all, though. Absolutely no way anyone could have rushed off without me seeing or hearing them. I felt a sick feeling in my churning stomach, chills throughout my body, muttering a few Hail Marys, and sped up to the top of the ridge, met my brother-in-law, and quietly we hiked our way out of the woods to his truck, in the spreading dark of evening. This has bothered me for years, and I have not been back in those woods ever since. When I was in middle school, my family moved into my mom's childhood home to take care of my grandfather. This property was in the woods near Lake Michigan. Everyone refers to it as the Valley. I grew up hearing all my aunts, uncles, and cousins' scary stories about growing up in the Valley. Once my family moved in, we quickly learned why the Valley truly is the most evil place we have ever been. My mom worked the third shift while my dad ran his business out of our garage. One night, I needed to talk to my dad, but he wasn't in the house. Knowing he was probably working in the garage, I checked. Across the yard, I saw all the lights on in the garage and what sounded like the radio blaring. Convinced my dad was in the garage, I walked over there and I decided to leave the safety of the house. I focused on the welcoming light of the garage and began sprinting across the 100 or so feet of pitch darkness. As I entered the garage, I felt relief as I called out to my dad. This relief proved short-lived as I instantly froze and realized something was wrong. Standing in deafening silence, I didn't see my dad anywhere. I heard something that sounded like a radio just moments ago, but now all I could hear was my own panicked breathing. I would not have made the terrifying trip over if I had not listened to that convincing sound. Before my heart had the chance to start beating again, I took off toward the house. What previously took me 30 seconds, I now covered in 10. I was so terrified, I decided it was best to solely focus on the door and getting back inside. As I burst through the door, I found my dad in the living room, looking as if he had been there for hours. Like so many horrifying experiences at that house, I just tried to not overthink it and moved on. It was not until a few years later after I moved out that I would be reminded of this experience. As I've previously mentioned, my family often tells scary stories of the Valley, and this is what we found ourselves doing one night. As it became my brother's turn to tell a story, it didn't take long for it to sound very familiar. My brother described the same instance of needing to talk to our father. He saw the lights on, heard the radio blaring in the garage, and was convinced he'd find our dad working there. He ran through the darkness only to discover exactly what I did. Nothing. No sounds of the radio, and no dad. It was the next bit that had my blood turning to ice though. While I tried not to scare myself further and focus solely on the door, my brother did not. As he turned back running towards the house, he made the mistake of scanning his surroundings. He saw the distinct outline of some form on top of the roof, and to his absolute terror, it was not human. What appeared to be the silhouette of some sort of man stood stock still right above the door, and this was the path that he had to use to get into the house. This creature was so dark it contrasted against the surrounding woods. I have no idea how he summoned the courage, but my brother ran like a bat out of hell back to the house and through the door. Once hearing his version of events, I couldn't help but wonder, if I had just looked up when approaching the door, would I have discovered that I was not alone either? My sister, mom, and I started going up to a town around Lake Huron for a few days vacation after my mom and dad split up. It's kind of like a daughters and mother bonding thing now, and a friend tagged along with us this summer. The town was populated with tourists and had a river and tubing canoe marina right in the middle. This marina is where you can rent tubes, canoes, kayaks, and the like. You can go downriver with them. The tubes are way slower, so you are just floating and keeping up with the river's speed essentially. We weren't new to the idea of floating down a river, and it was not insanely fun, but it was very relaxing. So we get going. I noticed that the river is broader and more extensive, and longer than rivers I've gone down before. Now, if you don't know, basically we go upriver and go all the way down until it pushes us out into Lake Huron. There were large, steep hills and cliffs on each side, with a road close by for the marina to drop tubers and canoers off. Just floating along, probably about an hour after we started, my sister, friend, and I are holding on to each other's tubes, so we're like a floating pod. My mom is floating a little bit behind us, sleeping probably. We reach this straightaway type area with steep hills on the side of the road. I hear a loud cough coming from the top of a mountain. A loud, fake cough, like a ahem type cough. Why is someone trying to clear their throat so loudly in the middle of nowhere? All three of us look up and there's a large, hairy man with a giant belly standing naked on top of the hill, rubbing one out and just staring at us. He got our attention soon enough that we spent the suitable amount of time it takes a person to float past this, and we got a good look at him. We were all stunned, and my mom somehow heard nothing. When we finally passed, I saw him turn away and go back into the woods and away from the river. I thought I saw him try to come out again further down the river, but he had just missed us going by. It wasn't until we passed him that I told my mom what we saw, and we reported it back to the marina when we got back around 2 hours later. It still to this day has to be one of the grossest things I've ever seen, and who knows how many unlucky people had to see that sad sight, and who knows if that person did anything worse to people. This might not be a necessarily terrifying story, but it was so strange and downright creepy and uncomfortable that I felt like it would be worth sharing. So I was in 7th grade and really into music and going to concerts. My dad told me we could see Badfinger and War at a free show in Toledo, Ohio. As far as I know, they have this concert every year. It's called Party in the Park and takes place at this lovely park right on the banks of Lake Erie. I was a little hippie who wore rose-colored glasses. My favorite band was the Beatles, so of course I was ecstatic to see a band that had been signed to Apple Records, and I was also psyched to see War, as I love Lowrider and Spill the Wine. If I recall correctly, Badfinger was playing one day, and then, a day or two later, War played. I think I also had the opportunity to see Blue Oyster Cult, but I passed. So anyway, I went to Badfinger, I got my picture taken, and an autograph from Joey Molland. So I was in my 60s music nerd heaven. My dad kept wandering off to get food or beer or speak to people he knew in the crowd. My mom probably would have flipped out if she'd known that my dad was leaving little teen me unattended at a free concert in Toledo, especially on the banks of Lake Erie. A lot of crazy stuff happens here, but I didn't mind a bit because I was feeling like a grown-up and independent. After all, I just met an absolute rock star, so obviously I was okay, and nothing terrible would ever happen the same day something so extraordinary happened, right? It got dark very quickly after the concert, and I really wanted to go home. But my dad kept running into people he knew and chatting with them. He bumped into some guy, and the guy tried to show him his new boat, parked or docked or whatever, right there within sight of the stage at this concert. I was pumped to get on this boat and hang out. Still, there were all these super hot older men, by which I mean 2 guys who were probably 17 with slightly above average looks, on board. I was shy and clumsy, and I worried I would struggle to get onto the boat without falling over. So I said I'd hang out with inside of the ship and people watch, and my dad was like, cool, whatever, let me on that boat. I was standing there probably cheesing, pondering just how fantastic my day had been when this guy walked up to me and kind of punctured my happy little cloud. He was almost 7 feet tall, solid, and a little chubby. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s and gave me the creeps. I also didn't like him because he looked very much like Mark David Chapman, and as previously stated, I was all about the Beatles at the time. Stephen King met and signed an autograph from Mark David Chapman not too long before MDC shot John Lennon. Stephen King described him as, "The lights are on, nobody's home, the house is haunted." This guy had that look going for him. At this point in my life, I'd never really been approached by strangers, and I just spoke to him like I would have spoken to anybody else. He asked me about the concert, and I happily chattered away, then asked where I was from, who was with me, I pointed out my dad, and then he asked me if I had a boyfriend. At 13 years old, I didn't know yet whether to answer this creepy guy's questions, or really much about dating. But when somebody asked me if I had a boyfriend at the time, my answer was always gonna be no, obviously. I told him that I didn't have one, and I didn't really want one, I was 13. He started telling me how beautiful I was out of nowhere, and how my face was beautiful, how my body was beautiful, and how I seemed so much more grown up than 13, and all the while, he was looking at me in a way that made me feel like I was going to throw up. I have never been looked at like that by anybody, and never really since. It wasn't one of those looks where like, oh, I'm infatuated with you. It was one of those looks that, ooh, you're my prey. And, of course, it would have to happen from a gigantic man that could easily overpower me and do whatever he wanted. He started reaching toward me, and I kept taking steps back while talking to him because I was raised to not be rude. I was so afraid and so disgusted by how this man was looking at me that I was nearly in tears. Then, out of nowhere, my dad came running up and said he had been looking for me, and we had to leave right away. This guy ran away. Sprinted. He was clearly not up to anything good. I saw his eyes when my dad ran up, and he looked genuinely afraid, like a deer caught in the headlights. My dad is useless about talking about anything complicated. He had a rough childhood that he never really talks about, so he just started chatting all sunshiny about where we were going to eat. I tried to shake off what had just happened and felt so bad. But when we got to the restaurant, I had to go off to the ladies' room and cry. I was too innocent even to be afraid that I might have been kidnapped, murdered, or something else. What was messing with my head the most, though, was how he looked at me. I was so pumped about puberty, which I'd already hit. But the thought of having breasts and all that stuff was fantastic, having hips was excellent. I couldn't, really wait to be an adult. But now, for the first time, I'd experienced a feeling of having a female body is almost like a liability. I blamed myself for a while. I felt something about me must be wrong to have made an adult man act like that with me. I know all of that is BS though, but it was a rotten time for me, and it took me a long time to get over it and understand and learn and grow. My dad and I never talked about that ever again. I never told my mom or stepdad either. I pushed it out of my mind and didn't even think about it for a long time afterward. I'm just grateful my dad came and scared that guy off when he did, and that he had the decency not to kick that guy's ass right then and there, because I would have been mortified to death, which would have been even worse. Because my dad had a light and a cheery demeanor afterward, I could pretend what had just happened wasn't as dangerous as it was. When I was about 16 years old, I got a job as a personal assistant / cleaning lady for a wealthy couple living in a big, beautiful mansion on Lake Michigan. It was a great job then, but after a while, I had to quit because of everything going on, and I'll tell you exactly what that was. I made $12 an hour as a 16-year-old girl, which was just crazy to me at the time. But now I know it's because the homeowners couldn't get anyone to stay to work for them. But I didn't see them all that much during the school year, so it was fine. I would work 40 hours a week in the summer and part-time while in school. So during the school year, I would hardly ever see the homeowners and would be left alone to clean the house. I had a key, alarm, and gate code, so I let myself in and out as I pleased essentially. In the summer months, I had help from a few other employees, but in the school year, it was just me. At first, I loved being in the house alone. Don't get me wrong. The place was gorgeous, right on Lake Michigan, had a beautiful view of it. I'd always open all the curtains to let the sun shine in and blast the surrounding sound speakers while I cleaned. It wasn't until I was alone that I started noticing how weird the place was. Nothing ever felt welcoming about the place. Sure, it was pretty to look at, but it was modern and everything was marble and stone. Not a very homey feeling. My first experience happened when I was cleaning one day in silence. I remember not turning on the music because I had a bad headache that day. Suddenly, the speaker to the upstairs part of the house turned on. The way their speaker system works, you can control it by a touchpad in the kitchen, which would play music everywhere besides the basement and main bedroom. To play music in those areas, you must go to the touchpad, turn it on by the control pad, and sync it up with the rest of the house. The reason this was so alarming was because I was the only one there. I walked up the stairs to check what was going on and figure out why the music turned on, seemingly by itself. I looked around and called the homeowner's name, thinking someone had just come in without me noticing, but the doors were still locked and no one was home. I shut off the music and went back downstairs, not thinking too much of it. It started happening more often though. I'd be listening to music and it would turn off, or it would be off and turn on in a completely different area of the house. I brushed it off as faulty electronics and didn't really think much of it. The second most prevalent story I remember from working there was when I was cleaning the workout room in their basement. I never wanted to go into this room, and I couldn't tell you why. Something about this room just felt weird. It was super cold and dark, and I felt anxious in that room no matter what time of day. I tried to avoid it at all costs, but my boss would get mad when the dust would build up. so I forced myself to go down there once a week to tidy up. So anyway, I was in the workout room using a broom and mop. I remember sweeping the floor and propping the door open against the machine while I used the mop. Suddenly, the broom fell over, hitting the wall, and the baseboard to the floor as it was fell, causing 3 distinct knocks. What I heard after scared me so badly I refused to go into that room by myself ever again. Immediately following the knocks made by the broom falling, 3 knocks responded in the exact pattern the broom fell, but it was coming from inside the wall. I know what you're thinking. It was not an echo. It was not some sort of scared animal. It was knocking. Deliberate knocking. I was utterly alone in a big, quiet house in the middle of nowhere on Lake Michigan, and someone was knocking back at me from inside the wall. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced. Lastly, this was the first and only time I've ever seen anything paranormal with my 2 eyes. And I know this time it's not me being paranoid or crazy because I was with a coworker who saw it too. Sometimes my boss would rent out her guest house, and we would clean it before the guest would arrive. So this guest house has a big glass hallway leading from one main area of the house to another. I was cleaning the house while one of my coworkers, Bob, was standing next to me. Just then, I catch a glimpse of what looked like a boy in a blue shirt running by. I turned my head just as Bob turned his head as well. He asked me if I saw that too, and I said yes. Thank you for sharing my stories. Hopefully everybody enjoyed them. I grew up in the state of Michigan, in a town called Port Austin, right on the Great Lake of Lake Huron. It's a small town with not much to do besides peruse the small mom and pop shops or go to the diner in the center of town and check out some cool classic cars at the show that is held once a week. Whenever I could, I chose to escape the mundanity and go to my father's cabin in the neighboring city of Grindstone. It was a small community town with nothing but woods and farmland and a nice area for hunting and fishing, once again on the shores of Lake Huron. At the time, I was 14 years old and I went up for the weekend with my older brother, a Marine straight out of Iraq, returning home that same weekend from a short hunting trip. My brother was tough as nails and he wasn't afraid of anything, but that day I would see a side of him I wouldn't soon forget. We took the ATV and headed out to a cornfield with an abandoned farmhouse. To set the scene, we were hunting pheasant in the cornfield that opens up to a clearing, and beyond that is the beautiful Lake Huron. We entered the opposite side, which is smaller, lighter woodsy area, but has a trail where we parked the ATV that leads out to the cornfield. We headed out fairly late, sometime around 4 p.m. after fishing earlier that day, and hadn't had that much luck, so we were deciding to head back at around 7 p.m. As we were exploring the abandoned farmhouse, my brother sat down for a cigarette and called me over to the front to check something out. His face was pale, and he choked on his words. He told me to look over there and pointed. I saw a huge wolf about 300 yards in the clearing ahead of me, standing on its hind legs. This thing was massive and covered in thick black fur. I couldn't really see how tall it actually was from the distance, but its legs looked huge and this thing was muscular with an oddly shaped torso and long, slender hind legs. My brother told me to grab one of the shotguns. When it heard him, it turned and looked exactly at us, seeming to be leering slightly. It then took a few strides on its hind legs, then went down on all fours and darted into the cornfield in the direction of our ATV. It was starting to get dark now. The sky was red, purple, and orange. We decided to enter the cornfield from the farthest end that this wolf went into. I was on flashlight duty, so I could see all of our surroundings. While he walked ahead of me with a shotgun the entire time, I felt like I was being watched, and I swear I heard nearby rustling and low growls and snarls when we would stop. Eventually, what was a 10-minute walk seemed to take an hour. We made it to the trail where the ATV was parked. I started to calm down now that I could see my surroundings better, and that's when I heard the iconic horror movie cliche of a branch or twig snapping, followed by rustling in the cornfield behind us. I shined the flashlight on a patch of stalks where I thought I heard the movement, and sure enough, I saw a pair of yellow reflective eyes about 6 feet high through a crack in the cornstalks. My brother yelled at it to F off. Then it let out an eerie howl that sounded like it was right in my ear. My brother fired one shot, hitting the top of the cornstalks, and then told me to hightail it to the ATV and get it started. I started it, and when I felt him jump on the back after me, I punched the throttle and floored it across to the access road and then onto the main road that cuts through the town. I looked behind me once or twice and saw a huge black mass dart across the road quickly, from out of the cornfield into the darkness of the woods. We headed back to our house, in town that night, and didn't return until about 12 p.m. the next day to collect our things from the cabin, still unnerved. I had always heard the rumors of the Michigan Dog Man, but I always thought it was just an old wives' tale, like the boogeyman that my dad told me to scare me straight as a kid. I thought it was just some state urban legend like the skunk ape of Florida or chupacabra, etc. To this day, my brother and I talk about it over some beers, but it was definitely a scary experience for the both of us. I even still go hunting in those parts to this day, but haven't seen anything since, and I hope that I don't see it again. Not too long ago, my mom wanted the family, my parents and 3 siblings, to go on a 2-week vacation, sightseeing various sites in California while camping. Well, this quote-unquote camping was just us renting cabins. Closer to the end of this vacation, we stayed in a cabin motel type of place not too far out of the Sequoia National Park, if I remember correctly. It was in a small town with just a couple hundred residents. The area the cabin rentals were situated reminded me much like a motel setup. The cabin was recently updated and modernized. It was overall very nice. Yet I got a sense that my family and I were not the only ones staying in that cabin that night. I did not want to be alone in that cabin at all. This is coming from someone who enjoys being alone on a normal basis. I told my sister about the uneasy feeling I had, but she tried reassuring me that maybe I just didn't like being in a new, unfamiliar place. It didn't really work, and I continued to feel uneasy the entire time. I would be taking a shower and would feel watched. Every so often, when I would be the only one left alone in the cabin, I would hear knocking on the walls. I would ask my family and siblings, and nobody would admit to doing this. Luckily, we left only after 2 nights, and I eventually forgot about the unease. A few months later, my mom and I were watching Dateline together. This was one of our favorite shows to watch. They had images of a cabin and motel type thing that looked an awful lot like the one we stayed in. My mom looked it up, and it ended up being the exact same one. It turns out, that episode was about a killer who had been a handyman at the cabin throughout the 90s. I feel like I'd been able to tell that someone had died in the cabin my family had stayed in. I didn't know about this killer before I stayed at the cabin. I can't be sure though. I don't think the police were able to confirm that someone was killed in the cabins. The killer had only been convicted of 2 murders. It's suspected he killed many other people though, but it still hasn't been confirmed. I don't think he stopped at just 2 murders in my personal opinion. Do you guys think that maybe I encountered the spirits of one of those victims? I'd love to know in the comments. When I was 8 years old, we moved to the place where I still live to this day. The house lies at the end of a dirt road in a rural village. Surrounding the house are fields, scattered forest, and many more patches of grass. Our property is not very large, just the ground directly surrounding the house. In front of the house is an open grass field with some small tree patches here and there, as well as some higher and lower parts. It's not completely flat. After what I think is around 1 mile, the field stops and the trees start. I had only gone out there a total of 3 or 4 times to explore when I was younger. Most of the times I had a friend with me. The last time I went there must have been 4 years ago. At first glance, the trees seemed to go on for a long time, but after only about 50 meters or so, there is a dirt ridge to the left, and to the right. These ridges are about 2.5 meters high. Then, suddenly, as if misplaced, there are a few cabins with no pattern to their positions, scattered over roughly 250 meters with a shallow pond and thick wood on the sides. Between them is grass and thin bushes and some trees. The whole area had a rectangular shape. We had crossed the ridge at one of the rectangle's short sides. The cabins all looked like they were built sometime in the 80s with flat roofs. When we first went there, we thought it was odd, but it could just be an abandoned resort or something like that. But when we started to look through the window, inside, most were empty or had some things covered with blankets on them. I remember thinking it was creepy, but when we found animal remainders all over the land behind the ridge, way more than usual in the woods, we started to get really scared. As we went deeper into it, which was only when we were there the second time, I remembered thinking how odd it was that there were no signs or anything to mark this as someone's property, and there were no roads leading to it either. When we got to the end of it last time we went there, it felt like we were being watched intently. As we wanted to leave, I spot a tall, hooded man in dark clothing walking towards us about 80 to 100 meters away. It looked like he had a rifle swung over his back. My friend and I started running away as fast as we could in the direction of my house. I didn't see the man following us. Once we reached the ridge, our view of the man is blocked by the cabin. But my friend climbs over first and I follow him. We run and don't stop running until we were home again. We have never told our parents or anyone else because we don't think they would believe us. My friend doesn't really like to talk about it, but I wanted to share this story because I feel like I'm slowly forgetting details every year that passes. I haven't been back there, nor have I seen that man ever after. I still have no idea what that place was or who the man was, and I'm happy that we got away in time. Also, English is not my first language, so I do apologize for any typos or errors, Swamp Dweller. Thank you for sharing my encounter. When I lived in rural Maine, my boyfriend at the time took me on a drive in his truck. He wanted to show me something he said he had learned about from one of his college professors. We already kind of lived in the middle of nowhere, but we drove even further into literally nowhere. We were on this road that was 5 to 8 miles of just forest on both sides. No houses, no signs, no driveway. Nothing but a winding road. Then he pulls over near a slight break in the trees. There was a very overgrown old driveway chained off. It was dilapidated, with signage that said private property. We parked on the road and walked about a half mile. Eventually, we came upon this old, abandoned log cabin-style house. I don't know when it was built, but it was old enough to not have any connection to the electricity grid and no electrical outlets inside at all. It was a bit odd, but my boyfriend said he had been there before and led me to a door in the back where we could break in. He mentioned that the last property owner said in their wall that no changes could be made to the property after they died, like no agriculture or major renovations, so I guess that's why the land was never resold since nobody could do anything with it. I don't remember if we entered through the second floor somehow or climbed up the stairs once inside, but I remember being on this loft that overlooked the interior of the cabin, with no railing, probably a 15-foot plus drop right at the edge of the loft. Maybe there weren't any stairs inside at all. Not even a ladder. I don't really remember. It was back in the fall of 2011 when I was a freshman in college, so it is a bit fuzzy being over 10 years ago now. I remember seeing an old wood stove made of iron downstairs and a countertop, but otherwise I think the place was sparse and made entirely of wood. There was no sink in the kitchen area and no bathroom, so no plumbing either. The loft we were on literally had thousands of dead flies all over the floor. It was creepy and downright gross. I know they could have gotten stuck there over the years, but the sheer number of them, covering every surface, and they had not been decayed, they just turned to dust. It was just so unnerving. My boyfriend, for some weird reason, decides this is a nice place to smoke some weed. I didn't want to stay, but he laid a blanket out over the flies and sat down and rolled a joint. I did take a couple of puffs, but started getting real uneasy really quick, so I stopped. I'm a regular smoker, but this was just a weird situation, and I didn't want to make myself any more paranoid than I might have already been. Then suddenly, I realized that the sun was setting and we were losing light, very quickly. The cabin very quickly got this terrifying, impending doom feeling, and I knew I just needed to get the hell out of that cabin. I expressed my concerns to my boyfriend multiple times, each time seeming more desperate, but he was not worried and took his sweet-ass time hand-rolling himself a cigarette and taking all the unnecessary stuff out of his pockets, laying them out on the blanket, slowly putting them away. It was pissing me off, and he wasn't taking me seriously, and I had such a sense of urgency to get the hell out of there. I ended up leaving out of the cabin first, and started hauling ass down the half-mile, long dirt driveway to get out and away. My boyfriend shuffled behind me, fumbling with things in his hands. He was practically a prepper and carried all sorts of things with him in his pockets, cargo pants, backpack, etc. Always things like flashlights, lighters, weed pipes, rolling papers, etc. We got out of the woods just as we were losing that last light before the true darkness set in. Mind you, this country road has no streetlights the entire way. He had flashlights, but I didn't feel that flashlights equaled safety. I felt we were being watched, and whatever it was super negative. I don't know if I overreacted or my boyfriend was literally just doped up and clueless, but I never have really trusted him after that. I don't know why the heck I let myself get in that situation. He's not in my life anymore, of course, but I'll never, ever jump into some random abandoned cabin, ever again. I remember feeling odd the whole trip, although our camping trips were routine at that point. Every month at this time, my best friend Josh and I would pick a weekend and head to a nearby forest for a couple of days to go hunting or fishing. This time around, we had chosen a scenic valley near the base of Mount Rainier, with a cabin built on a small ridge right above the river. We decided to try our hand at panning for gold, and I was filling my Jeep up with shovels and even a sluice box Josh's dad had let us borrow for a few days. He had also contacted the claim owner for us and got permission so we could mine his gold. "You got your GPS?" Caitlin asked as she packed up some sandwiches for the road into my backpack. I walked over and kissed her while brushing a stray strand of her black hair from her face. "Of course, hon," I replied. I promise no repeat of what happened last fall. Last fall, me and Josh had gotten lost due to some extenuating circumstances. Point is, we learned the importance of keeping a good, high-quality GPS on hand. Trust me, in a bad situation, it's a lifesaver. Josh and I had grown up together. We were next-door neighbors as kids, and a mutual love of anime, video games, and the outdoors cemented our status of inseparable friends. When I was hospitalized in grade school after getting hit by a truck, Josh was at my side, cracking jokes, and he was the one who took pride in painting me as a total sleazeball at my wedding sit-down dinner when he gave his best man toast. There used to be a great picture of us together, groom and best man, but I had found it a few nights ago, and Josh's image had been burned off. A grim reminder of the fire that burned a couple rooms in my house last year. After my wife finished making sure I had all my ducks in a row, she gave me a kiss and sent me on my way. A short drive took me to Josh's house. Josh had his long, black hair in a ponytail and was swinging his daughter Samantha around in the air as her musical laughter filled my ears. "Uncle Gray!" she screamed as Josh set her down and I stepped out of my Jeep. She ran around and hugged me at the knees, laughing. Then she stepped back, looking towards her house as she had just remembered something, and took off running with a small wave. Josh laughed as he fondly watched his daughter run inside. "I'll go get my bags, bud. You want anything? A beer? Water?" I shook my head. "Well, I don't give a damn," he said. "You'll still have to come say hi to Cassandra. She's going to feed you, so just sit down and eat." Cassandra was raised by her grandmother and had the habit of cooking for anyone that came over ingrained into her being. I chuckled and walked to the kitchen. At least her food was very good. It took about 45 minutes for Cassandra to be satisfied we had eaten enough to let us leave. As we loaded up into the Jeep, Samantha came running across with 2 brown paper bags. "Here, Daddy, Uncle Gray, I love you," she said, handing us each a bag, followed by a kiss on the cheek. Her and Cassandra stood on the driveway waving at us as we left. It didn't take us long to arrive at the cabin. We took a moment to call our wives and let them know we made it safely. Then we headed to the river to try some panning. I found a shallow area where I was able to set up the sluice, and Josh dug up a bucket of dirt and squatted in some shallow water to do some serious panning. After a few hours, we had each retrieved small amounts of gold. Far from enough to make us rich, but enough for us to go home with something shiny. When we went back inside, Josh showed me this ugly little figure he had found. It looked like something out of one of those Blair Witch movies. I told him to get rid of it as it probably had some bad juju. He shrugged and tossed it into the firewood. That night by the campfire, the uneasy feeling had returned. The night felt off. Even the joint wasn't helping me relax. The trees seemed to be gnarled, more so than usual, and some of the long shadows seemed to be moving on their own. Josh, by the fire roasting a hot dog when we heard it, a distinct howl filled the valley air, making my hair stand on end and chills run down my spine. Wolves aren't unheard of here in Washington, but they're also not very common. I also noticed, at that moment, that all the nighttime sounds had suddenly stopped. The crickets, the frogs, the owls were all completely silent. Feeling instantly nervous and alert, I dropped the joint as my eyes scanned the tree line. It was dark and hard to see into the darkness after staring into the fire for so long, but I could vaguely see a few hunched-over shapes slowly creeping toward us. I started walking backwards, not taking my eyes off the dark and taunting shadows. The vague outlines danced in and out of my vision as my eyes adjusted to the shades of darkness in front of me. I could sense Joss walking backwards next to me. And then an unspoken cue. We both took off sprinting to the door. We got inside and slammed it shut, sliding the locks into place as we caught our breath and made shushing gestures at each other. We both listened as whatever it was slowly walked around and inspected our campsite. We heard loud sniffing, a bag being ruffled, and then a strange sound that was like something wooden being knocked on the door. We heard an angry growl, and then everything went silent. I almost dared not to look at one of the windows illuminated by our still crackling fire, but I had to. Fortunately, I didn't see anything terrifying. But at that moment, we heard something that made everything we had experienced so far that night turn into a stroll in the park. Laughter. To be specific, it sounded like a little girl laughing outside. It sounded just like Samantha laughing outside. Josh's eyes were wide open and a look of anguish crossed his face as he ripped open the door. There was nothing there. He screamed, "Sam!" and took off running into the woods. I tore after him, but no matter how fast I went, he kept picking up distance on me, until eventually he vanished out of sight in the tree line. I kept hearing that childlike laugh just at a distance in the shadows, teasing me before it disappeared completely. Suddenly it was like a switch was flipped on. All the animals regained their voices, the sound of crickets chirping was thick in the air, and I heard the hoot of an owl far off in the distance. I spent the next 2 hours searching, calling out Josh's name to no avail. I couldn't even find any tracks to follow. When I finally did lay down, it was very late and I barely slept. I woke up the next morning to find all of our equipment outside and supplies still there, but no sign of Josh. I walked into the woods yelling for him, looking for any signs of his passing. Nothing. I called his phone, but it just rang until it was picked up by voicemail. I realized then I was going to have to organize a search party. I called my wife to tell her what was happening. She stopped me almost right away and asked me, Who is Josh?" "You know who Josh is. He's my best friend." "You don't hang out with anyone named Josh," she insisted. "Unless you're keeping something from me." I laughed. "That's very good. Okay, fine. I'll play along. He was the best man at our wedding. He has an adorable daughter named Samantha who loves her Aunt Caitlin." I expected to get a laugh from her. Instead, what she said made that terrible feeling return. "Babe, are you okay?" she asked. She suddenly sounded very worried. "Come home right away, sweetie. You're not making any sense." I promised I'd be home soon, hung up, and called Cassandra's phone, expecting Samantha to pick it up like she usually does. Instead, Cassandra answered. She sounded worn out. "Cass," I said. "Cass, listen to me. Last night, Josh heard something that sounded like Samantha and ran off into the woods. Now I can't find him." Who's Samantha?" she said. "Who's Josh, and who the hell are you? How did you get my number?" The interaction went downhill from there. She soon hung up on me. I felt like I was going to be sick. None of this made any sense. First, that conversation with my wife, and now the one with Cassandra. I'd love to say I figured out what happened, but no. Nothing has been the same since that camping trip, and I doubt that it will ever make any sense. I've spoken to Josh's parents. They remember me just fine, but like everyone else, they insist that Josh and Samantha aren't real. I'm slowly coming to grips with the idea that they may have been somehow erased. with the idea that somehow they stopped existing entirely. I have absolutely no idea what we encountered in the woods at the cabin that night. I have no idea why things are this way. What I do know, though, is I found 2 brown paper bags filled with chocolate chip cookies in my Jeep. If Josh and Sam aren't real, where did the cookies come from? My name is Mikey, and I am 17 years old. I live in a small town with a lot of forest and woods, so it is common to see hunters out and around town with their gear. Hunting is a very big pastime in my town. With that comes a few days off early in the school year, just for kids to go hunting with their family. Me telling you all this will make more sense soon and will help you make more of the situation. So about a year ago, I was with a small group of friends. Their names were Ethan, Zach, and Josh. Since our towns are so boring, we must make do with what we have, and that leads to more illegal activities like exploring abandoned buildings, since our town has a lot of those. It was getting dark out, and all of us decided to leave Zach's house to go to an abandoned cabin in the woods that our friend earlier that day was telling us about. We texted him and got the address, and unfortunately he could not go with us that night, but told us it was steep and muddy, and he had to walk through the woods. So, wear bad shoes that, you didn't mind getting dirty. With that information, we got into the car and drove about 20 minutes out into the countryside of town. No cars were really coming past us at this point, and luckily, we got to the destination. There was a decent amount of service, but, of course, right as we got in the building, we lost all service. We found a pretty decent place to park on the side of the road and treaded our way up the steep hill. Our friend being right, it took us about 20-30 minutes to get up the hill alone because it was so steep and muddy. But the walk was worth it because ahead of us was a beautiful cabin with custom wooden carved statues out in front of the house with a unique copper roofing. At first analysis, it made me think that this was some sort of vacation home because of the size of the structure, but it was too torn up on the side of the house to be anything used at this point, if that makes any sense. I wouldn't say the building was entirely abandoned, because all it needed was a little renovation to be good as new. Of course, we weren't going to pass up on such a location to explore, and walked through the broken wall to get in. It led us to the inside main living room, which, without context of the outer house, you would think was a hotel lobby. We turned on our phone flashlights. It had gotten darker outside and didn't help the inside's interior lighting. We took videos and Snapchats of the place and made our way to the basement after Zach called us to it. We all were a bit jumpy and nervous at this point because we had no idea what was down there and couldn't even begin to fathom what could be there. I couldn't explain why I felt so anxious. The place didn't give off horror movie vibes, but something about the chilling coldness of the basement seeping through the bottom of the door was very odd, especially since it was so warm outside. After a bit of arguing over whether we should leave the door closed and move on our way, we decided to open it. Ethan was the one to man up and slowly edge the door open. We all got instantly quieter, and started to slowly push each other down the steps. It was very dark, but a green glowing light around the corner of the wall started flickering in and out. I was leading the group, and as I go to turn my head to see what was down, a huge stomping sound charges me, and I flip my head around, and I scream to run. We all bolt up the stairs and hear stomping sounds behind us. We all run to the top of the hill, and as I get ready to dip down, Zach drops down and stares at the house. Whoever was behind us was not behind us anymore, so I dropped down beside Zach, Dalton, and Ethan. In a normal situation, people would leave, but as I said before, this town is very boring, and we never get to do anything that's fun, and this is probably the most adrenaline we've had in our entire life. It was so dark that the person could not have seen us, which was good, but also bad because we couldn't see them. We lay there in silence for a moment and stare at the house. We all hold our breath as we hear something scraping the wood inside the house. A man comes out dragging something in a large trash bag. It could have been a body. It could have been anything. But Zach said it could be a deer. Me and Ethan, being how we are, instantly assumed it was a body. The man seemed in a hurry and dragged whatever it was out into a four-wheeler, which we didn't notice earlier, and he left. What was strange, though, is when he turned the lights on the vehicle in front of it, there was a tremendous amount of blood covering the pavement, and looked as if someone was dragged across it to create the blood trail. As he drove away, I got a better look at the bag and noticed it could not have been a deer because it was too small and extended farther outwards instead of like a large scale an animal would be. After watching all this go down, we went back down to the car and went home. After about a year later, we don't think about it much, but it was recently brought up in a conversation with kids at school, and no one believes us after all of us swearing it happened. We didn't end up telling our parents or police about the situation because we were scared we would get in trouble for being up there, but I wanted to share this experience to see what everyone else thinks about it. My name is Lynette, and I work with the park rangers in Washington State. My story takes place about a decade ago and doesn't involve anything supernatural or weird. No, it involves a very human element. I've been doing my job for 13 years and have yet to be scared before or since this has happened. It was a Monday afternoon, and I was getting ready to finish my shift for the day. As I was cleaning up and ensuring there was nothing that needed fixing in the coming days, I heard loud shouting a little ways off to my west. As I listened more intensely, it was clear two males were arguing with another, which was a severe argument. I heard cussing and then a loud screaming. I rushed toward the sound without thinking. I have a very caring heart and want to ensure things are okay. That said, I made a mistake at that moment. I didn't call for backup or call the cops as I should have right then and there. I was just so worried about the person I heard, and I got caught up in the moment. As I ran toward the screaming, I heard someone shouting, "Stop it, man! I'm sorry, stop it!" I'll never forget those words, and when I came over, what I saw made me scream as I went to a sliding stop. This was also a huge mistake. I probably should have been quieter, but the shock of what I saw made me scream. A man was bleeding out on the ground, and another man was standing over this man with a bloody knife in his hand, still stabbing the seemingly lifeless man. I panicked, and that's all it took for the other man to turn around, see me, and rush me. I remember hearing him yell, "Come here." I froze, and he was on top of me immediately. He had the knife to my throat and told me to give him my radio. He said if I tried anything, he'd gut me right then and there, just like he did that other guy. I was crying as I gave up my radio and stared at this man in the eyes. He looked utterly uncaring about anything he had just done. I had seen the evidence only a few feet away that he didn't care and would happily kill me. So I asked him what he wanted. He eyed me and gave me the most unnerving smirk I've ever seen someone give me in my lifetime. He grabbed me by the hair a moment later and threw me next to the other man. At this moment, I could still see he was still alive, but barely. I still remember his sputtered breathing as he choked on his blood, and I remember being sure I would die here at that moment. The man grabbed me from behind and tied my hands behind my back as I cried and begged him to stop. I remember him feeling my waist and thinking he was about to do something horrible to me before realizing he was merely checking me for any weapons or anything I could use. At first, this brought a subtle and strange form of relief until I realized he might just be getting ready to kill me. I mean, I'd seen what he had just done to the man dying in front of me, so it was unlikely he would let me live as well. I began sobbing, at which point the man punched me in the back of the head and told me if he heard me speak without permission one more time, he would end my life right there. Silently, I began to pray to God. I wasn't even religious, but I remember begging God internally to help me somehow. I cried but tried my best to keep quiet. The man reached into my pockets and grabbed my wallet before pushing my face into the blood-soaked chest of the now dead man. He screamed at me to not move and began laughing as he read my address. He took pictures of my family and said if I said a single word about this, he would find me and make me watch as he murdered my family before killing me. There was no hint of regret in his voice for what he had just done, and I heard him run off before long. I remember waiting until I was positive he was gone before rolling over and crying my eyes out. I couldn't control my sobbing, and I began screaming. This was several minutes after the man had left. After what seemed like forever, I heard my supervisor's voice coming over. He pulled out a knife, cut me free, and immediately held me while asking me what happened. I kept crying and wanted to say what happened, but couldn't get the words out. So he got me a towel and had me sit down by the tree a bit away from the body of the man who had been murdered. I had another coworker who watched over me while he called the cops. Much of this part was a blur, to be honest. When you experience extreme trauma, your brain destroys your memory for a time. I remember eventually calming down enough to explain what happened to another officer. She was very kind, and I remember telling her what had happened. When I say I remember telling her what happened, I don't entirely remember, but I can see myself talking to her, but almost like being out of body. The conversation is muted. I only say this to explain the effects of severe trauma on the brain, as I don't believe enough people take that sort of thing seriously or understand what it can do to someone. I know I explained it, though, as I still talk to the officer who helped me today. I required extensive leave, therapy, and much more after all this happened, but I did eventually come out on the other side of this, somewhat sane. I still have nightmares and evil PTSD about this event, but I am well enough to work, and now we have a policy of being in pairs to prevent something like this from happening again. I remember the dying man's body and watching him struggle to breathe. I never fully got over that. I should also say that they did catch the man responsible shortly after he left the scene. I still thank God every day that I'm okay. Gentlemen, all men strive for gold in their life, right? Gold medals, gold watches, gold everything. However, there is a certain type of man who goes the extra mile. He walks with the confidence of an eagle and giggles in the face of danger. He's a big, hairless, winning machine, and when he unzips his pants, he sees platinum? That's right. Manscaped would like to introduce to you their best and biggest ultimate hygiene bundle yet. The Platinum Package 4.0. Manscaped is the leader in the below-waist grooming area. Now trust them with the whole shebang. Join the 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped, including those of us here in the swamp, by going to manscaped.com for 20% off, free shipping with the code SWAMPED. Manscaped's brand new Platinum Package 4.0 is the biggest bundle they've ever offered, giving you a bulk discount on Manscaped's top products. Now personally, I've been using Manscaped for quite a long time, and in addition to shaving, you can now completely upgrade your shower routine with the Ultra Premium Body Wash and Ultra Premium 2-in-1 Shampoo Conditioner. You'll have your skin and hair feeling hydrated and smelling fresh for the ladies. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code SWAMPED at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com using code SWAMPED. It's time you enjoyed the finer things in life and get yourself a platinum package for your platinum package. I want to share a story about the park that I work in. It's in Washington and is a peaceful place overall. That said, there are some strange things afoot there. I've been a park ranger for 27 years. During that time, I've had one thing that I find unsettling. You can call me Debbie, as most people call me anyway. I wanted to share a story about the strange sounds coming from the park I work at. These sounds happen day and night, and I'm not the only person that has experienced them. There doesn't seem to be any discernible pattern to the sounds, and it sounds almost like chanting or even singing sometimes. I find these sounds unsettling because of what happens shortly after. Something always turns up dead. It's always been animals, although there has been the occasion or two where it's sometimes people. Usually related to health issues is the excuse the park will give, but I think there's something different. Because every time these chants or singing things start, something turns up dead eventually. The experience I will discuss involves a Monday morning. I know, Mondays, am I right? And this was the first time I had heard the chanting for myself. I had heard stories previously, but I had never experienced it for myself prior. I was doing my morning rounds when I suddenly heard this cold singing. In some ways, it was relaxing, but there was more of a hint of evil to it this time. I'm not saying the chanting itself is evil. There's that dread in the air when you hear it though. It's all alluring, but terrifying, all at the same time. Anyway, I hear this low sound. At first it is like chanting, and as time goes on it becomes more audible. I notice it sounds almost like a harmonic singing. I'm a bit perplexed and begin to look around. No one appears to be in sight, so I continue picking up trash and checking the area, not thinking too hard about it. Next thing I know, it becomes very audible. It's like when you're listening to music on your iPod or your phone or something. So there I am, looking around suspiciously, as no one is about to get the drop on old Debbie, when suddenly, I see something sickening. I see a dog laying on the ground. I head over and realize quickly that this thing has been ripped open. The dog is no longer alive, and the kill looked fresh. It also smelled fresh enough that I had to go elsewhere and relieve myself of the contents of my breakfast that morning. I called my supervisor and informed them of what I found. They had asked if I needed anything, or if I needed any help cleaning it up, and I told them of course, yes, right now. It probably didn't take long for someone to get there, but it felt like forever, and I kept my distance during that time. One of the guys I was working with at the time, Kyle, showed up with his little disposal kit and walked over and checked it out. It didn't seem to faze him too much, and I began questioning if I really knew him at that moment. He asked if I saw what had killed the dog, as it was all over the place. I told him no, I had not, and I wasn't about to go looking. Then he cleaned everything up and buried the poor thing. I can't even handle the sight of everything, and Kyle cleaned it all up, and it was like a regular Monday to them. After cleanup, he asked if I had heard anything weird prior, and I explained to him, yes, the strange chanting and singing everyone goes on about. I elaborated and told him I saw nothing kill the dog though. Now, that's the only time I've been witness to the immediate death of something after this weird chanting or whatever it is occurs. Kyle and many others working there have happened upon other deaths, and as I said before, it's like a normal Monday for them. So, most of the time, it's covered up with normal, human, explainable things like people choking on food or heart attacks. But I'm not so sure. All that said, I still do work at this park, and the chanting and singing is not as frequent as it used to be. It was a bit unsettling to hear, or even hear of. Has anyone around the Washington area had anything similar happen to them? I'd be very curious to know. I've been working as a park ranger for roughly 17 years. In all that time, I've had a few experiences I would deem strange and scary. The one I will share with you today is a little bit of both, mostly terrifying for me personally. You can call me Trent, by the way. I believe this was 2009. My team and I were working to clean the area and prepare it for the summer camping season here in Colorado. Now, it's a national park, so there's a ton that we have to do, but we like to go around and do cleanup in our area, as you have to do because people don't bother, honestly. And quite honestly, it's one of those things that gets on my nerves. It isn't hard to clean up your trash, but anyway, that's a different tangent. It was getting late, and I volunteered to stay after that evening to make sure all the cleanup was done. The idea for me at least was to get as much done as possible while we still had light. It being summer soon, we had plenty of light compared to fall and winter when it gets dark earlier. It wasn't long before everyone was clocking out, and I told them all goodbye, and I'd see them on Monday. None of my crew worked with me on my weekend shifts, though we did have a few within the department itself who did. An hour goes by and then two, and before I know it I'm so wrapped up in my task, and I look up and I realize I'm losing daylight. Thinking little of this, I put myself in another gear and tried to get more done. In my mind, I figured I'd just be better prepared and leave less to do Monday. Also, I take great pride in my work, so I do everything I can no matter how large or small the task. It's a large part of what has led to the promotion I've been given, and it is something I still do to this day. It is not long before I realize the sun is about to set completely. I stop my work, pull out my flashlight, and prepare to haul my last garbage bag back to the station and drop it in the dumpster. As I'm wrapping things up, I hear a large growling sound. I immediately grab my bear spray as I recognize the sound I'm listening to. Turning around slowly, I see much that leaves me in shock and dread. It looks to be a black bear, but the problem is it is much more significant than any black bear I have ever seen or even known to exist. This thing has a large scar across its left eye and is staring at me, baring its teeth. Normally, I'd do something to make the bear think I'm more extensive and more significant than I actually am, but no amount of posturing will save me from this monstrosity. This thing looked to be 12 to 13 feet tall on all fours. I didn't believe my eyes at first, but there was no denying it. The thing stood in the air, and I about pissed myself in fear. I wanted to run, but I knew running would only encourage it to give chase. I didn't exactly feel safe standing there though, so I kept my eyes on this thing as I slowly backed away. The thing was, I had found myself far away from the trails and was quite a bit off the beaten track from the station. Usually, this isn't an issue as you don't normally run into a bear the size of a mountain on your travels around this area. But today, this was not the case. I'm sitting there thinking about what my next move might be, all the while I'm slowly backing away. I know it isn't wise to stare this thing down, but there was no other way I was going to turn my back on this bear and run, or any other way to escape. I have my hand on my mace, and the other hand is holding on to the garbage. After an eternity, I am finally out of the sight of the bear. It appears to have just stared at me, but I'm worried that it was attracted to me because of the smell of the garbage. I'm sure it's nothing a bear would think twice about if it was hungry enough, and if I were the size of this thing, I'd be hungry all the time. After several minutes of watching the horizon and seeing nothing, I turn and start hauling my butt as fast as I can back towards the station. It is still quite a way off, but I figure if I keep moving, I'll get there in no time. While running, I suddenly hear a large stomping sound behind me. Looking back, it's the bear and it's coming in fast. I freak out and throw the trash bag I have off in a different direction. My hope was that it would distract it, just long enough for me to get away. But unfortunately, it ignored it entirely and kept coming for me. I am now forced to turn and stand my ground as there is no other way out of this. There's no way I'm going to outrun this thing. I stop, pull the bear mace off my belt, and prep to spray the hell out of this thing. It confronts me and we meet eye to eye again. It's only a few feet from me now, and to my shock it seems very aware of what I'm ready to do. The look that this bear made it seem like it was calculating its next move. I've seen a lot of bears and usually they'll scare off without too much trouble or even mind their own business entirely. This one though, the look on its face just said that it was hunting, and I was on the menu. It seemed disturbingly intelligent, and as it stepped forward, I reacted in shock and I sprayed it in the face with the mace. The bear reeled back. I ran for my garbage bag, though looking back I'm not sure why I did that, and I continued my sprint toward the station's direction. I heard the terrifying roar I've listened to throughout my life, followed by an extensive but all too familiar stopping sound. I'm feeling my legs begin to give away from fear, and I tell myself, if you give out now, you're dead. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I gain the mental fortitude to keep pushing through and steady as I run. As I'm getting closer to the cabin, I feel the thing running up from behind me. I freak out and spin to see wherever it's at, tripping as I do so, falling on my butt. The thing had taken a swipe and left a deep claw mark in the tree where my head was only seconds before. I pray and spray the bear yet again. It thrashes about blindly, and during the thrashing and my struggle to get up, it hits my can of spray and dislodges it from my grip. It does this with enough force for my hand to fly back and hit the tree. I see blood and feel pain as my hand smacks the tree. Unsure if I've broken my right hand, I use my left hand to stand up, and yet again, for reasons I'll never be sure of, perhaps it's shock and some semblance of normalcy, I grab the trash bag with my left hand and turn and continue sprinting. The bear is roaring behind me, but it doesn't appear to give pursuit. It isn't long before I reach the main trail and can see the cabin in the distance. Terrified, I keep running. Soon enough, there is another roar. I am not ashamed to admit I peed myself a bit, followed by the familiar stomping of this bear. I freak out and keep telling myself, don't look back, don't look back, don't look back. I run with all the power and speed I can muster, and have left a give, and I make it to the station. I open the door and slam it shut, locking it behind me. As I do, I feel the door's foundation shake as the bear seems to be banging against it. I barricade the door with some tables and whatever I can muster to move, and I immediately use the phone to call 911. The dispatcher answers, and I'm trying to explain where I am and my situation, and the dispatcher reassures me help is on the way. It doesn't take the police more than 5 minutes to arrive, but to me it felt like 5 hours. By the time they knock, I leap up in shock and terror at the sound. It is then that I remove the tables and slowly open the door. I am shaking as I try to explain the entire situation, and I feel tears involuntarily begin to fall down my face. Eventually, an officer sits with me, as does the sheriff, and then they try to take the time to calm me down. They ask if I need any medical attention, and I tell them no. They insisted anyways. They seem to see that I'm in shock, and I don't really feel much of the pain quite yet. I don't remember much of that part, but that's why they tell me that I need to go to a hospital. As I left the station, I remember looking back at the door and seeing a significant claw mark on our door. Now, I haven't seen this bear since that day. He hasn't turned up, and as far as I know, no one has been attacked by it. All that said, this is a situation that will stay with me for a lifetime. Hey there, Swamp Dweller. I got to say I can't believe I'm sharing my story, and it's a huge honor to do so on here. I have several encounters I'd like to share with the swamp, but for now, I will share my creepy experience of what I believe to be a haunted highway in my hometown. This occurred between Renton and Maple Valley, Washington. The road is Maple Valley Highway. It starts in Renton and continues for quite a few miles down into the Black Diamond. It is known for many fatal accidents and a scenic river that runs parallel to it. I would take that road all the time and had 2 occurrences. It was November 2013. I was driving home late around 10 p.m. that night. I had just finished hanging out with a group of friends from church. The road has patches of complete darkness, so I had my high beams on. I reached a part of the road with a guardrail on my passenger side. That side is all old growth in the Cedar River. I saw in front of me a sudden patch of thick, dense fog that only covered the road and a few trees off to the side. I turned off my high beams driving through the fog, and that's where I saw the thing. A tall, black figure passing along in front of my vehicle. I remember specifically the cars driving toward me had flashed their lights and halted as if they saw it too. I understand fog distorts lights and shadows, but it looked like the shape of a person, with long arms, and it was very slender. I couldn't make out anything else because it looked like a black shadow. As fast as it came, it was gone. I peered into my rear view mirror, and the cars were slowly driving as if to see what they saw too. As much as it startled me, I chalked it up to being a distorted shadow of a person who was running across the road. It did not make sense considering how late it was, and all that was there was the river on the other side. Nothing but a field and some trees on the other. Now fast forward to February 26, 2014, and I'm driving around the same time and a little bit further up the road in that same area. I had something very similar happen again. I was right before the Old Jones Road between Renton and Maple Valley. Again, right next to the river. I completely forgot about last November when I was on my way home from my friend. I was driving home along Maple Valley Highway around 9:30 p.m. passing the guardrail, and a figure jumped out in front of my car running from right to left. It was tall, skinny, and black. It was passing quickly. As my eyes followed it, a bird, possibly a hawk or something like that, came flying into my windshield, making it hard to see. It was just staying right in front of me. After about a few seconds, it flew away. I was terrified as I was desperately trying to look around the object to make sure I didn't hit anything in the road. It finally left, and I turned my view to the left to see the person-shaped shadow, the tall, lanky thing, fading away and completely disappearing in thin air. I was so startled. I called my mom to explain what had happened, and by the time I got home, my knees were shaking so bad. She didn't like me driving that road, and I even went out of my way to avoid it at night from then on. My car, I had at the time had a lot of issues, constantly breaking down, and I did not want to chance it. A few years later, I reached out to the Maple Valley community. Some people who lived out there had told me that this was a regular occurrence. One of the residents believed it stems to a local ghost story about a fisherman drowning in the river. This story is one I've wanted to write for a while now, but the words have always escaped me. For one, it's true. I know every story is true and very scary. This one, however, is as true as it gets, and as everyone knows, writing a series of incredible events while maintaining credibility is damn near impossible. I do invite and even encourage you to look it up on Google after it's finished if you're not satisfied. The second reason I found it difficult is that it's two stories in one. There is a lot of history involved, and though the details differ depending on who tells it to you, my hometown of Biddeford was first inhabited by Europeans in 1616, making it one of the first places to be visited in America, but the consensus is the load-bearing beam I will include. Thank you for letting me ramble. Now, for your story. I was born and raised in the city of Biddeford, Maine. The city itself is full of somewhat garbage people, but I wouldn't have wanted to grow up anywhere else. I had many wonderful memories, as the beach was an hour walk away, the backyard was sprawling, and the woods that led down to the river was right next to my house. It runs about 135 miles from New Hampshire and splits into the towns of Biddeford and Saco, emptying out into the ocean beyond. Most mothers, my own included, did everything in their power to make sure their children didn't go to the water until 3 people died at the beginning of the year. This may sound morbid, and indeed it is, but for good reason. All the children in the cul-de-sac knew bits of information, usually clashing. But I first heard the full story told by an old man named Rodney. Rodney was an old Native American man who lived down the other side of my backyard. His grandson Josh and I would often play games with each other and became pretty good friends over the years. Rodney was a good, spirited man, always telling us fun stories about the people of his heritage, and usually scary ones when we would be put in the tent out back and camping out for the night. It was one such night that I heard the curse of the Saco River. Back in the year 1675, Winter Harbor, now known as Biddeford, was well established by the Europeans. The local Secaucus natives generally welcomed them, and boats would come and go along the Saco River. One such boat carried 3 white men, who were said to be drunk as a skunk, and meaner than one too. A woman who had given birth to the chief's son was upon one of the islands, carrying the child in tow. They decided to have a little fun and test out a story they once heard. It was said that the Native Americans could doggy paddle from birth, and they wanted to find out, most likely making a few bets on it. Despite the woman's screams, they ripped the baby from her arms and threw it into the water. Unsurprisingly, the child had drowned. Some say she went in after him, only to drown herself. Others say differently. What eventually did happen is Chief Squandro, not to be confused with Chief Squanto, found out and placed a curse on the river. Until the day white men clear the banks, the spirits of the river would take 3 lives a year. Some say that the 3 were killed right there, but regardless, there were no delegations made. In fact, it was said to ignite violence between the tribe and the Europeans, kicking off the War of King Philip. There was a little more to it than that, I'm sure, but it's been about 26 years now, so my memory is a tad bit fuzzy. The one thing I can never forget, in fact it's probably what caused my terrible lifelong nightmares, is the night he took us out fishing. Conveniently enough, Rodney took us by canoe out to Skelton Dam. It's a popular place for fishing and swimming. In late summer, the sun is warm, while being shaded by a large forest around it, and as the sun goes down, the sound of wildlife makes it an unparalleled place to relax. He had paddled us down the stream for about an hour when finally, the night came. We didn't catch a whole lot, and honestly at 7 years old, I hardly knew what I was doing. But I had fun with Josh, and Rodney was telling more of his stories of the past. I don't know what time it was, possibly 10 or 11, but fog began rolling across the water. Rodney made a crack about the spirits making their way from the deep, when all the noise from the bank suddenly stopped. There were no insects, birds or frogs to be heard, just the quiet sloshing of water on wood. I don't think we even noticed it at first, not until I could see the dead serious look on Rodney's face. He didn't say it, 'cause he was too scared. He said something to the effect of, "We better pack it in." So we reeled in our fishing poles and he started the long trip back up the river. Being children, Josh and I didn't really panic. Rodney was experienced in the woods, and though he stayed silent, he didn't much let on that something was wrong. He just kept his eyes forward and worked the oars. This went on for a while. The sounds of nature were still silent, and it seemed as though every small sound echoed from one side of the river to the other. The fog was still present and was growing thicker by the minute. I don't know how Rodney didn't get lost, but I assume it wasn't his first time in conditions such as this. The closer we got, the more we let go of our fear. That is, until the crying began. I couldn't tell from where, but like a gunshot out of the silence, this shrill, high-pitched sobbing rang out from the land. It was so loud, like it was right next to you, then seemed to move away only to return just as quickly. To make it worse, the sobbing would erupt into insane bursts of laughter. Even thinking about it now makes me shiver. Not a male or a female, it was something I can't possibly find words to match with. As it continued, we started to hear something, jumping through the forest, easily keeping pace with the boat. I tried to block most of it out, but that's not something that ever goes away. I believe that was about the time Josh and I began to cry ourselves. Rodney tried to comfort us, telling us to keep our heads down and cover our ears, but most of his efforts were spent rowing in a panic-driven manner. The tone of his voice was quick and stern, nothing like the tight look on his face, and I believed he was praying. The sob crying stopped after a few minutes, to our relief. However, it was short-lived. A woman's voice shot out from somewhere, distant but also close, in a blood-freezing tone. It screamed, "Help me!" I looked out through the fog. It wasn't a woman I saw. However, on the bank to the right I could make out a thin figure. Not many details were visible, aside from the long horns that sprouted up from the side of its head like that of a deer. The image quickly melted back into the fog and disappeared. Once again, "Help me, please," came from the bank. The opposite one, however, the one closest to us. As this happened, the sound of drums came and quickly crescendoed their way all around us, like that of a dozen or more people playing drums. Rodney told us once again not to look and steered the canoe away, towards the center of the river. I looked over to see large green orbs of light begin to appear, along with multiple little men. I say men, but they were all much too short, and the shape wasn't quite right. It was almost like a group of monkeys were all lined up along the shore, just staring at us, as that ghastly cry for help continued to follow, switching sides from time to time. I'm certain I had wet my pants by then. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life, including at my current age now. Unfortunately, our boat trip through hell wasn't quite over yet. The fog was a constant and would swallow everything almost as quickly as it appeared. As terrifying as the things on the bank were, at least they couldn't get to us. Or so I thought. We must have been close to the boat launch by that point, but before we could get there, the sounds of splashing erupted on all sides of us. The occasional slosh of water told us there was something around our boat, and it wasn't long until the knocking began. It was soft at first, more like something was rubbing the sides of the canoe. Then it turned into scratching, but they quickly got louder as if people were pounding their fist against the sides. It was getting so bad I thought we were going to tip, and poor old Rodney was rowing like a madman. The panic on his face was clear as day. He was no longer trying to be silent, and I could even see something trying to grab and pull at the oars. These sorts of short, black arms that grabbed at whatever they could. We finally made it to the boat launch, Rodney practically throwing us on land. He didn't bother with our bags or fishing stuff either. I was somewhat upset the next day, but I can't blame him one bit. We ran to his truck, still hearing drums beat all around us, now coupled with sounds of loud growls. I can't tell you for sure what it was, but some sort of animal was pacing around us. They kept their distance, thank God, but before we were fully on the road, we were in for one more surprise. The branches and leaves of the trees off to the left had begun shuffling. The forest here is thick, so it was hard to see what it was, but some sort of large bird burst through the canopy and shot across the lake. I've never seen anything so monstrously huge in my life. Rodney later told me he believed it was a thunderbird. I'm not sure, but the wingspan was anywhere from 20 to 30 feet long. Since that night, I've stayed away from that river. In fact, I moved halfway across the country. I can't really tell you a whole lot else from that night. I never got many answers myself. I can tell you, however, that I believe there is a curse on the Saco River, wholeheartedly. This is not my personal story, but one my aunt told me about. It was the early 2000s. I was a small child at the time, and my aunt had set off with my other aunt for a fishing trip on the Washita River in Arkansas. On their way, they stopped at a local store for snacks and drinks. They got their business done in the store and was on their way once again. They arrived at the boat ramp around 2:30 p.m. and set up their fishing gear. They fished for hours, catching a few fish, but mostly just passing the time by talking. They talked and talked till night fell, and thinking they should probably pack up and head out, they began to gather their fishing gear and packed up. Before they could reach their vehicle, a white sedan pulled up in the boat parking area, and my oldest aunt could make out two figures in the vehicle. Instead of proceeding, they hid behind some rocks and watched them closely, waiting for them to get out. Almost positive the people in the car hadn't seen them stay behind those rocks. Almost positive the people in the car hadn't seen them and they stayed behind those rocks, contemplating on what they should do. From the angle that they were at, they could tell that the car had the driver's side door blocked. They sat there a while longer, waiting on the car to pull out of the parking lot, but it never did. So, with barely any service, my oldest aunt managed to get a hold of my uncle and tell him about the mysterious white car hindering them from getting in and leaving. With no hesitation, being the big badass my uncle is, he was on the way. Several minutes had passed by, but eventually my aunt could see the headlights of my uncle pulling into the ramp parking area. About the time he stepped out, pistol on hip, is when the white car roared to life and sped out of there. In relief, my two aunts, shaken up from the experience, came out from behind the rocks. They wanted to follow the car, but with no knowledge of which direction it went, they decided it was best not to, and reported the incident to the authorities. Nothing ever became of the incident, and I've since grown up and moved from my home state. I live in North Carolina now and have had a few more weird and scary encounters I could share. I don't think about what happened all those years ago on the river too often, but I sometimes wonder what could have happened. For the longest time now, my one true passion in life has been fishing. I have a high-pressure job as a stock trader in my hometown of Philadelphia, and nothing seems to help me unwind from a stressful week quite like a day's worth of fishing on the river. I think it's the combination of the serene setting, the slow, steady pace of it, and the fact that I'm reconnecting with nature, when most of my life is spent in a stuffy office space staring at a computer screen. But there's always been one dream fishing trip that I've always wanted to go on, but never really had the time to arrange, and that's bow fishing down in Louisiana. Ever since I saw a segment on it on the World Fishing Network, I just was dying to try it. I had always wanted to try out archery too, so combining that with my passion for fishing just seemed like the obvious choice. I had mentioned it once or twice to the wife, and being the great listener that she is, she ended up arranging a trip down to the bayou for myself and a few of my buddies for my 37th birthday. We flew down to New Orleans on the Friday morning, which I had no idea was named after Louis Armstrong. Then spent the day hanging around Bourbon Street drinking cocktails and soaking up the jazz. Then, after fighting off the hangovers the next day, we drove down along the Mississippi River to this little place called Buras, where we found ourselves at NOLA Bow Fishing Charters. The guys down there were awesome, sharing all their little tricks and techniques with us to ensure we would have a lucrative trip. Then, once the sun had set, we loaded up into the boat and set off into the swamps. It really was like a dream come true for me. The landscape down there really is something to behold. But here's the thing. The shallow bottom boat we were in had these floodlights on it just below the waterline. Most fishermen will tell you that this is basically cheating, since the fish tend to be attracted to lights, especially in the nighttime. But since we were using bows and arrows, I guess it kind of evened out the odds a bit. However, having lights on your boat like that totally ruins your night vision, so as much as you can see the waters around you perfectly clear, it blinds you to the darkened areas beyond, and that makes you feel goddamn vulnerable indeed. There could have been anything out there in the darkness, just watching us, and we'd have absolutely no idea it was there. So, we're having a ball for the first hour or so, mostly just making fun of each other for missing our shot so much. But eventually we all start getting the hang of the whole accuracy thing. We're pulling in all kinds of black drums, redfish, and flounder, which are delicious. But I couldn't see any of the one fish I wanted to shoot, and that was an alligator gar. I had had my heart set on getting my hands on a big 10-footer to show the guys back at the office, and I was worried the entire trip might pass up before I get the chance to shoot one. But eventually one of my buddies is looking over the side of the boat, into the brightly lit, murky waters, when he calls out to me that he sees this big old gar hiding among some reeds just a few feet away. He knew I was after one, as was everyone, so everyone got out of the birthday boy's way, so I could get a clear shot on it. So there I was, right up on the edge of the boat with my bow and arrow in hand, trying to steady myself to get a good aim on this gar. Jesus Christ, was this thing huge! I mean, it was easily a 10-footer. The exact kind of monster that I had been dreaming of getting my hands on, and I really had to regulate my breathing to keep my hands from shaking too much. Only just as I start to get ready to aim on the thing and I'm about to fire the arrow into the water, it starts to slowly creep away further from the boat, almost like the goddamn thing knew I had my eyes on it. But I wasn't about to let it get away, and as dumb as this was, I start leaning over the edge of the boat so not to lose it. That's when I lose my balance. I start wobbling, tipping over the side of the boat before my buddies could reach out to grab me and reel me in. Bow in hand, I crash into the murky waters head first, getting absolutely soaked in the process. I can hear the guys in the boat laughing their asses off before I even resurface, and when I finally do, I got to admit I was laughing too. But as I look up from the water, they don't seem so cheerful anymore. They're all just looking behind me, staring at something with these looks of terror on their faces. I'm all like, what's the problem? Before I look behind me, seeing this pair of glassy eyes glowing in the lights of the boat, just before they disappear under the water. It was an alligator, and it was huge. I start scrambling to get back on the boat, trying and failing to scale the side of it before the thing got to me. All my buddies rushed to my side and grabbed me, but the bow fishing instructor rushes to the opposite side, grabbing one of the two of my friends and imploring them to do the same. He suggested this so the whole thing wouldn't flip over and we all end up in the water with this thing. Just as they got a grip on me and started dragging me up forwards, I feel this intense pressure on my right boot. It was horrible. I just started screaming, "It's got me! It's got me!" over and over, feeling my leg beginning to stretch from the guys dragging me up, and the gator trying to drag me down. Then suddenly I'm free and the guys pull me back up onto the boat, but that didn't bring any relief, as in that moment all I could think about was now that the gator had bitten my goddamn foot off. There was no pain, but I've heard that in those adrenaline-fueled moments you don't normally feel massive injuries. I'm scrambling around in the boat, trying to look at my leg, half expecting to see a missing foot and blood pouring out in the bottom of the boat. But to my infinite relief, all I see is a soaking wet sock covering my still attached foot. The pure goddamn relief I felt in that moment. I can hardly put it into words. And it didn't take me all that long to figure out that a hangover had basically saved my life. Since I was feeling so rough that morning, I had not bothered to tie my boots up that tight, giving them enough slack to allow the alligator to pull it right off my foot. It was without a doubt the single most terrifying moment of my entire life. Seeing that thing's eyes practically glowing in the floodlights of the boat put that absolute fear of God into me, and I know how lucky I am that I was able to walk away from the situation with all my limbs still attached. I could just as easily have bled out right there lying on that boat, thousands of miles away from where my wife and kids were, while my buddies looked on helplessly. We took a fair amount out of the swamps that night, and I suppose it was only right that the swamps took something back. I didn't manage to catch the gar I had been lusting after in the end, but that was okay by me, I guess. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true in-the-woods horror stories. I hope you liked this extra long upload today, and if you enjoyed it, make sure you hit that like button as it helps the swamp grow a ton. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, please give this a 5-star rating over there as that helps me grow a ton. It's very much appreciated. If you have a story that you would like to share, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net. I'm always looking for fresh, brand new scary stories to share with the swamp. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications if you're new, as I upload videos nearly every single day on all things natural and supernatural. You can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories absolutely free from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. Don't forget to join me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I now have a new Discord as well, and I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.